Hi everyone, it's me, Tim. Today I want to talk about localization. Localization is when you make a version of your game for distribution outside of whatever country you originally made your game for. Now this is an answer to a question from Johnny Catswill, who asked, you mentioned adapting your games to different cultures and languages. I didn't find a video on this topic on your channel, so let me ask my questions here. And by the way, I really thought I had a video on this and I didn't, so good catch, Johnny. Johnny had 4 questions. 1, what game development aspects are affected by localization except language? 2, we can see different games are popular in different parts of the world. Did game design play a role in this? Do different game mechanics work better for different cultures? 3, did you ever abandon an idea, like a quest line or a mechanic, etc., because it might not work for wider audiences without publisher interference? 4, what countries outside the US and Canada impressed you by the size of the fan base that follows your games? Those are 4 very different questions. They're good. I'm going to go through them in order because I'm afraid if I try to just talk about localization, I'm going to ramble. So I'm going to answer in order. I'm going to start with your first question. What game development aspects are affected by localization besides language? So, by language, I'm going to assume you mean just pure translation. Like, the person says hello and you change that into bonjour or whatever you want to change it into. Just that translation is a lot harder than you think. There are words that are not allowed in some country. Like when we did Fallout, we originally were calling the chems drugs, but in the US that's kind of frowned on, and in other countries you literally can't do it. So we changed it into chems. I know in some countries I've seen games come out where they call things potions and they're very obviously drugs, but potions for some reason are okay, drugs aren't. Art frequently gets translated, and for a lot of different reasons that are very specific to countries. For example, in Germany, you weren't allowed to show blood, but they're very specific by it meaning stuff coming out of a living creature and being red colored. So you could change it to a different color, and suddenly it was okay. And I think sometimes games said, "Oh, these are robots; these aren't people." I don't know the exact thing. I just remember playing games where they bled and it wasn't red, and I could tell even with my colorblindness. China has an interesting rule of you can show bones, but you can't show bones going through flesh. So you can show a skeleton if it's just bones. But if you have a zombie who, like, the rib cage is showing through the chest, you can't show that. You either have to have them intact, so you only see flesh. Even if it's ripped open, the skin's flayed off, and you see the muscle underneath and blood coming out, that's fine, but don't show a bone. Or they have no flesh on them at all, and they're just a skeleton. And then a lot of places have you can't show children if they can be hurt in any way. I've run into this a number of times. It's why several of my games got shipped without children in them. I've talked about how it's hard just to make children invulnerable, because in games, especially like Temple, since the children would provide cover, or there were rules saying I can do this if I'm within 5 feet of an enemy. Even if the attack you're doing isn't on that enemy, it's something that your ability is allowed if you're within 5 feet. So just making the children something you couldn't target wasn't enough. So we had to just get rid of them. But that rule appears in a lot of places, and you just have to think about it. And that doesn't have anything to do with language. However, speaking of language, localization is a lot harder than you think in just doing language. I mentioned in another video that some languages have really good ungendered pronouns. So they have he, she, and then a third thing meaning I don't know the gender of that, which is great for saying, oh yeah, I see someone crossing the street down there. We have someone, but a lot of languages have, where you could say, oh, he's crossing the street, but you don't say he. You say a pronoun that literally means I don't know the gender of the person I'm referring to. Similarly, poetry is really, really hard to translate. Sometimes it's best because, how do you get the rhyming scheme in the new language? But other times, if it's something like Jabberwocky, where it's deliberately designed in a clever way that takes multiple English words and jams them together. So when you have brillig, it's a combination of brilliant, I think, and frigid, or anyway, it causes connotations in an English speaker's mind that you won't get in a non-English speaker's mind. And brillig isn't a word you can translate. So what you have to do to translate that poem is break it back down into the words that were combined, translate those, and then recombine them to save the connotation. That's really hard. Also, if you ever have misunderstandings in your games, it's very hard for that to survive a translation. Perfect example of that was in Temple of Elemental Evil, where if you're playing a dumb character who's talking to a miller, who takes grain and mills it into flour, Flour, and he says he wants to date the local widow, and he says maybe someone suggests you take flowers, and you can misunderstand that into a bag of flour, Flour instead of Flower. Guess what? That doesn't work in a lot of other languages because flower doesn't sound like flower in a lot of other languages. So it requires the translator to figure out what you're doing and try to come up with something clever. And keep in mind, part of that cleverness was it was a miller you were talking to, someone who makes grain into flour. So the best way to do that would probably be to come up with what flour is in your language, Flour, and then translate it into something that would be a gift you give to someone that you can have a misunderstanding for. And hope the game doesn't have art associated with it. So if you show up at the miller's door and you can be holding a bag of flour or a bunch of flowers, that's going to be hard to localize. Whew. Wow, that was just question 1. Question 2. We can see different games are popular in different parts of the world. Did game design play a role in this? Do different game mechanics work better in different cultures? I will answer it this way. I have never specifically designed a mechanic for a country. Or I guess better said is I've never designed a mechanic for a specific country. However, over my career, I keep hearing about things about other countries. Sometimes people will back me up on it. Other times people go, oh, that's not true. So I think it's kind of a general thing, but it's not. A lot of people don't feel that way. The one I heard the most was that non-linear games are less popular in some countries. And I usually hear this in reference to Japan. And the reason for this is they don't like that there's no right way. They want to know, what is the way I was supposed to do this quest? And when your answer is, there's a bunch of ways and none of them are really the best way, apparently that can be, as a culture, that's kind of like, I don't like that. I want to know the right way to do it. I've heard a similar thing about superheroes, that in some countries they like self-made heroes and not like Batman, somebody who, he made a suit and he practiced karate and whatever, and he fights crime using his own abilities, as opposed to someone who got their abilities because they were just born with it, like Superman. So I don't know if that's true. I hear about things like that, but I will say I don't ever design with that in mind. So the third question is, did you ever abandon an idea, like a questline or mechanic, because it might not work for a wider audience? And did you do this without publisher interference? Well, let me just say that I did abandon a lot of things because of publisher interference, and I've talked about that. Lesbian character got ripped out of Temple, names got changed, quests got removed. But I was trying to think of whenever I did it without publisher interference. The only thing I can think of is, after making Arcanum, I completely abandoned the idea of putting in gender-based differences into the character creation and level up process, because there was a lot of negative feedback in Arcanum. Now, bear in mind, all I did was make it so that if you played a man, you got a +1 here and a -1 here, and if you played a woman, you got a +1 somewhere else and a -1 somewhere else. I don't even think it was that. I think you got a +1 if you're a man in one stat and a +1 in another. Basically, it was different, and you could completely undo it in the character editor if you wanted to. A lot of people didn't like that. The one reason I wanted to do it was every decision you made in that character editor made a difference in your character. Background, skills, attributes, magic spells, everything, except gender. And it just stuck out at me, like, maybe that should have a difference. And I based it on that, in general, men are stronger than women, and in general, women have higher pain tolerance than men. And I based that on studies, and I said, okay, we'll give a man a +1 strength, and we'll give a woman a +1 endurance. People didn't like that. And it's weird. The feedback I got was so bizarre. Like people who thought that, who agreed with me, were like, yeah, if you put 100 random men into a room and 100 random women into another room, and then you randomly pick a man and woman, chances are the man you randomly pick is going to be stronger than the woman. In rare occasions, it's not true, but overall, in general, when you do that, it's going to be true, because in general, men are stronger than women. But a lot of people go, that's not true. For any man you pick, I can find a woman stronger. That's true too. Doesn't undo the basic premise. But then I had people going, then why do you care? Why do you want to bother? And I'm like, okay, then I'm not going to do it anymore. Now here's a scary side story though. I know someone who discovered in the 90s that there was a drug on the market that had a different effect on men than women. A different effect. He wanted to publish this, and everybody told him not to, that he would take a lot of heat. And he was like, no, you don't understand. I'm not being sexist or misogynist here. This is something that needs to get published, because men and women should know that this drug will affect them differently. It will have different side effects on them. Nope. And this was in the 90s. And then I think 10 or 15 years later, when he had PhD students of his own, there was a woman who was getting her PhD under him, and she thought about doing it, but then she said, no, I don't want to do it. I still don't want to touch that. And this is what's scary out there. There are drugs out there that matter. Your gender matters, but they won't tell you. And there are also drugs out there that your weight matters, but they won't tell you that either. It's a weird cultural thing. And good luck figuring out which ones they are, and and if those side effects are going to be bad or mild for you. Anyway, that was a weird digression. Final one. What countries outside the US and Canada have impressed you by the size of the fan base that follows your game? I've always been surprised at how popular Fallout and my games are in particular countries, some other games. But Fallout in particular, I remember finding out how popular it was in Poland and also in Russia. We didn't make Polish or Russian versions. At least I don't think we did. I was if a version of that was made, I was involved with it. But I found out they really like Fallout. In fact, they LARP. They do live action role playing, like weekends where people go out to the woods and pretend they're playing Fallout in real time, in real life. That blew my mind. I had no idea that was happening. I think it's really cool. It's something almost I want to watch, because I would like, that's an interesting thing to watch. But yeah, that really surprised me. And subsequently I found that there are some of the games I've made have been really popular in very specific countries, and that surprised me. And I don't know what it is about those countries that make that particular game attractive. I don't know if it's a mechanic. I don't know if it's part of the storyline. I don't know. But I think it's really cool. Anyway, Johnny Catswell, I hope I answered all 4 of your questions.